At 80 years old, a wealthy woman falls ill and accepts the suggestion of her trusted lawyer and friend to move into a retirement home, but she had no idea of his true intentions. Margaret Thompson had lived in her two-story Victorian home in the leafy suburbs of Charlottesville for over 40 years. Each room was filled with the memories of a life well lived, photographs of family vacations, antique furniture inherited from generations past, and a grand piano that still held the echoes of festive gatherings. At 82, Margaret maintained a zest for life uncommon for her age, attending book club meetings, managing her late husband's estate, and occasionally outsmarting opponents at the local bridge club. This morning, however, as she walked through her garden, something felt amiss. The autumn chill was sharper, the leaves rustled ominously, and a sense of foreboding settled over her as she clutched her shawl tighter. Later, while preparing tea, her hands trembled inexplicably, and her heart fluttered with an unusual rhythm. It was then that the floor seemed to sway beneath her feet, and she found herself sinking to the floor, the room blurring around her. When Margaret awoke, it was under the stark fluorescent lights of a hospital room, with her daughter Susan sitting anxiously by her bedside. The doctor spoke of a mild stroke and recommended a period of observation, but Margaret's thoughts were elsewhere, on the fragility of her independence. As Margaret recuperated in the hospital, her longtime friend and attorney, Henry Aldridge, came to visit. Henry had been a pillar throughout her widowhood, helping her manage the vast assets left by her husband. With his sharp suits and reassuring demeanor, he exuded an air of competence that Margaret had come to rely upon heavily. "Margaret, you've always been the epitome of independence," Henry began, his voice smooth and calming. "But perhaps it's time to consider a setting where help is readily available. There's a wonderful assisted living community, Willowbrook Estates, that offers both autonomy and care. It could be the perfect balance for you." Margaret listened, her mind wrestling with the idea. The thought of leaving her home, with all its memories and comforts, was daunting. Yet Henry's words carried weight. He spoke of Willowbrook with such high regard, mentioning the gourmet meals, the lush gardens, and the array of activities tailored to enrich the lives of its residents. "It's just something to think about," Henry concluded, placing a glossy brochure on her bedside table. "Take your time, Margaret. I only want what's best for you." After Henry left, Margaret picked up the brochure, flipping through images of smiling seniors engaged in various pastimes. Could this really be her future? The decision loomed large, casting a shadow over her newfound vulnerability. As she drifted to sleep, her dreams mingled with visions of Willowbrook's manicured lawns and the walls of her beloved home, each beckoning with promises and warnings. 2 weeks later, Margaret found herself standing in the elegantly appointed lobby of Willowbrook Estates, her suitcase at her feet, a mixture of apprehension and resignation in her eyes. The facility was indeed as picturesque as the brochure had promised, with its sprawling grounds, sunlit atrium, and residents chatting amiably under ornate chandeliers. The air was perfumed with the subtle scent of jasmine, piped through hidden vents, designed to soothe and welcome. As she was escorted to her new apartment, Margaret's guide, a cheerful young woman named Lisa, extolled the virtues of Willowbrook. "You'll love the library, Margaret. It has an excellent collection of classic and contemporary titles," Lisa said, sensing Margaret's love for reading. The apartment itself was a pleasant surprise, spacious, with a view of the rose garden and walls adorned with tasteful art. Despite the comfort and luxury, a sense of unease tugged at Margaret's heart as she unpacked her belongings. This was a world manufactured for tranquility, yet it felt slightly off-kilter, as if beneath the surface lay a script everyone but her was following. As night fell and the sounds of Willowbrook quieted to a whisper, Margaret felt a loneliness she hadn't anticipated, a stark contrast to the life she'd known in her own home, filled with personal memories. Margaret's initial days at Willowbrook passed in a blur of organized activities and carefully curated meals. However, the more she settled in, the more she noticed small, disquieting inconsistencies. The staff, always smiling, seemed to watch the residents a little too closely, their eyes tracking movements with unsettling precision. One afternoon, while attending a watercolor class designed for residents, Margaret overheard a hushed conversation between two staff members. "Make sure Mrs. Thompson's medications are logged and adjusted according to the schedule, Doctor." "Harper set," one said, not realizing Margaret was within earshot. Medications. Margaret hadn't been prescribed anything new since her arrival. Curiosity piqued. She decided to pay closer attention to her interactions. That evening at dinner, Margaret engaged her table mates in conversation, steering the topic towards their experiences at Willowbrook. "It's lovely, but don't you find the regulations a bit constricting?" she probed gently. The question was met with a momentary silence, followed by nervous glances. One woman, Mrs. Bradley, leaned in and whispered, "It's best not to question too much. Easier that way." Disturbed by the conversation, Margaret lay awake that night, her mind racing. The control the facility exerted was subtle but pervasive. Why was Henry so insistent on this particular place? The seed of doubt germinated quickly, sprouting tendrils of suspicion that something more sinister might be underpinning her serene surroundings. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's discomfort grew. Determined to understand the true nature of Willowbrook, she began a discreet investigation. It started with the medication mix-up she had overheard. Quietly, she asked to see her medical records under the guise of checking on her health, but the staff was oddly reluctant, citing privacy and policy reasons that didn't quite add up. Her suspicion deepened one morning when she found a medication chart in her room during cleaning. The chart listed several drugs she knew she wasn't prescribed, all noted under her name. When she confronted the nurse, the explanation was muddled at best, something about a mix-up with another resident's chart. Margaret, however, kept the chart as a piece of evidence, hiding it among her books. Around the same time, Margaret received a call from Susan. "Mom, are you sure about this place? It feels off," Susan said, echoing Margaret's fears. This prompted Margaret to be more vigilant. She started documenting everything: odd conversations, staff behaviors, and any deviations from normal routines. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a locked filing cabinet in a seldom-used staff room during one of her afternoon walks. The lock was a simple one, and Margaret, using skills from a long-forgotten youth spent in her father's tool shop, managed to open it. Inside, she found files on several residents, including herself. Shockingly, the contents revealed detailed psychological profiles and medication records that suggested an alarming level of behavioral control. Realizing the gravity of her situation, Margaret knew she needed allies. She turned first to Dr. Ellis, the facility's doctor who had always seemed kind and genuinely concerned about the residents. One evening, she approached him under the pretense of a routine health check. During their meeting, Margaret carefully broached the subject of her findings. Dr. Ellis's initial reaction was one of skepticism, but as she presented the medication chart and her observations, his demeanor changed. "This is serious, Margaret. I had my suspicions, but nothing concrete. This," he paused, indicating the documents, "this could prove something sinister is at play." Together, they planned to gather more evidence. Dr. Ellis would look into the medical side, checking the prescriptions and orders given to the pharmacy. Meanwhile, Margaret decided to reach out to Susan to come and visit, hoping that an outsider's perspective might help validate her concerns and strengthen her position. Simultaneously, Margaret found another unlikely ally in Paul, a fellow resident with a background in law enforcement. He had noticed similar irregularities and was eager to help. "I've seen enough in my years on the force to know when something doesn't sit right," Paul confided. Together, they formed a small but determined group, each motivated by a personal sense of justice and protection for their fellow residents. As Margaret lay in bed that night, her mind raced with the possibilities of what they might uncover. The sense of isolation she had felt upon her arrival at Willowbrook was now replaced by a burgeoning sense of community and purpose. She was no longer just a resident. She was a catalyst for change. Margaret's small team worked with a newfound urgency. Dr. Ellis, having accessed the pharmacy logs, confirmed discrepancies between what was prescribed and what was documented in the residents' charts. This confirmed their worst fears. Some residents were being medicated without their consent, likely to make them more compliant. Paul, meanwhile, utilized his investigative skills to track the financial flows from Willowbrook. He discovered that several high-cost medications were being ordered, but never appeared on the pharmacy's actual delivery lists. "It seems like someone's creating a paper trail to justify expenses that aren't really there. It's a classic embezzlement scheme," Paul explained to Margaret one afternoon as they pored over the documents in the privacy of her apartment. As they delved deeper, Margaret realized that the implications could be far-reaching. If they were right, this wasn't just about medication mismanagement. It was a systemic abuse of trust and power. "We need more than just evidence," Margaret told her allies. "We need a way to bring this to light, beyond the walls of Willowbrook." Their opportunity came unexpectedly. One evening, during a community dinner, Margaret overheard the facilities director mentioning an upcoming inspection by state regulators. This was their chance to bring external eyes to the situation. Quickly, they devised a plan to discreetly hand over their findings to the inspectors without alerting the facilities administration. The day of the inspection was fraught with tension. Margaret and her allies had prepared a concise report of their findings, including copies of the falsified medication records and financial documents. They had agreed that Dr. Ellis would be the one to make the handoff, as his position granted him the most credibility. As the inspectors toured the facility, Margaret kept a low profile, watching the proceedings from a distance. Her heart raced as she saw Dr. Ellis approach one of the inspectors, a folder subtly changing hands. The moment was fleeting, yet it held the weight of all their hopes and fears. Following the inspection, the atmosphere at Willowbrook shifted. The administration seemed on edge, unaware of exactly what had transpired, but sensing that something was amiss. Margaret noticed more private meetings, and the staff appeared more guarded in their interactions with the residents. During this unsettling time, Margaret received another mysterious letter, this one more direct than the last. It warned her of potential repercussions for meddling in affairs beyond her grasp and urged her to cease her investigation. The threat was veiled but clear, yet instead of intimidating her, it only solidified her resolve. She shared the letter with her team, and they realized the gravity of what they were up against. "Someone powerful is watching, and they're worried," Paul noted, his voice grim. "We've hit a nerve, and they're pushing back." This realization brought a mix of fear and determination. They understood that their actions could have serious consequences, but the thought of stopping never crossed their minds. They were too close to revealing the truth. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, the silent witness of her apartment walls seemed to echo her defiant thoughts. She was no longer just fighting for herself, but for all those who couldn't fight for themselves. A few days after the inspection, Margaret attended a scheduled residents' meeting, ostensibly to discuss upcoming events and facility updates. The room was charged with a palpable tension, as if every participant was aware that the usual pleasantries were merely a veneer over deeper, unspoken anxieties. Halfway through the meeting, the facility director, Mr. Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably in his chair before addressing the group with forced cheerfulness. However, Margaret, keenly observant, noticed the subtle signs of strain on his face. It was clear he was waiting for something, perhaps news from the inspectors. As the meeting drew to a close, 2 state inspectors unexpectedly entered the room. Mr. Reynolds stiffened, his facade cracking slightly. The inspectors asked to speak privately with him, but not before giving Margaret a discreet nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but to Margaret, it signaled that their covert efforts had not been in vain. After the inspectors and Mr. Reynolds left the room, an uneasy silence fell over the remaining residents. Margaret, seizing the moment, stood and addressed her fellow residents. She spoke earnestly about the importance of vigilance and advocacy for their rights, subtly hinting at the ongoing investigation without revealing specifics. The next morning, Margaret was called to a private meeting with Mr. Reynolds and the inspectors. In the room, palpable tension mixed with a sense of impending resolution. Mr. Reynolds looked defeated, the lines of his face deepened by stress. The inspectors laid out their findings plainly. Significant discrepancies in financial and medical records had been uncovered, pointing to systemic mismanagement and possible criminal activity. Margaret listened intently, her heart heavy with the confirmation of her suspicions, yet lifted by the promise of justice. Mr. Reynolds was asked to step down, and an interim management team would be installed to oversee the facility's operations during the investigation. One of the inspectors turned to Margaret, thanking her for her courage and assuring her that the evidence she helped provide was crucial. In the days that followed, Willowbrook Estates underwent a transformation. The news of the investigation spread quickly, leading to an outpouring of support from families of the residents and the community. Margaret found herself at the center of this whirlwind, her actions sparking conversations about the rights and treatment of the elderly in assisted living facilities. As she walked through the now familiar halls of Willowbrook, Margaret felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. There was a sense of empowerment among the residents, a shared resolve to never allow such oversight to happen again. She had not only uncovered a scandal, but had also ignited a movement. Reflecting on the tumultuous events, Margaret felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had faced one of the most challenging periods of her later life, but emerged as a pivotal figure in a larger fight for justice and dignity. As she settled into her apartment that night, the walls no longer seemed like silent witnesses, but rather like steadfast supporters of her journey. The first episode ends with Margaret looking out over the garden, a content smile playing on her lips as she watches the sunset. The veil of deceit at Willowbrook has been lifted, thanks to her efforts, and while the future is uncertain, it is undoubtedly brighter. In the wake of the upheaval at Willowbrook, Margaret felt a mix of relief and renewed responsibility. The interim management had been installed, and there was an air of cautious optimism among the residents. However, Margaret knew that the deeper issues of trust and oversight at assisted living facilities required more than just managerial changes. One crisp morning, Margaret met with Susan and Dr. Ellis in her apartment. The table was strewn with notes and documents as they formulated a new strategy. We've exposed one facility, but there could be others suffering from similar issues. We need to think bigger, Margaret proposed, her voice firm with resolve. Susan, ever the pragmatic one, suggested reaching out to advocacy groups and the media. Let's make this a national conversation. We can use our experience here as a case study to highlight systemic problems in elder care, she said, tapping on her laptop. Already searching for contacts, Dr. Ellis nodded in agreement, adding, "I'll continue to work from the inside. I can gather data on medication and treatment protocols across other facilities owned by the same group that runs Willowbrook." Their plan began to take shape. Susan would handle external communications and build a network of support. Dr. Ellis would collect internal data, and Margaret would work on rallying the residents and their families for a broader campaign. It was a daunting task, but the trio felt empowered by their recent success and the potential impact of their efforts. Susan wasted no time in making connections. Within a week, she had arranged meetings with several major elder care advocacy groups and secured a preliminary agreement to feature Margaret's story in a prominent national newspaper. The prospect of bringing their issue to a wider audience added a new layer of urgency to their work. Meanwhile, Margaret took on the role of a community organizer within Willowbrook. She held regular meetings in the common room where she shared updates on their actions and encouraged her fellow residents to share their experiences and concerns. These gatherings quickly became a powerful forum for collective expression and support. Dr. Ellis, for his part, faced challenges in gathering data. The new management was supportive of his efforts, but he encountered resistance from some quarters, including a few staff members who were wary of further scrutiny. Nonetheless, he managed to compile a report detailing discrepancies in medication administration practices not only at Willowbrook, but across several related facilities. As they delved deeper, the trio discovered that the issues were more complex and entrenched than they had initially thought. Financial mismanagement, lack of qualified staff, and inadequate oversight were common themes that emerged from Dr. Ellis's findings. Margaret, using her newfound platform, decided to organize a town hall meeting. She invited local health officials, representatives from the Elder Care Oversight Board, and the media. It was a bold move, one that would put Willowbrook and its issues under a public microscope, but Margaret was determined to shine a light on the problems they had uncovered. The town hall meeting was set in the largest room available at Willowbrook, adorned with banners stating "Justice in Elder Care." The room buzzed with the energy of residents, community members, and a few suspiciously quiet facility staff. Margaret felt the weight of the moment as she surveyed the crowd, knowing that the discussions today could spark significant changes or fierce opposition. As people settled, a surprising figure approached Margaret. It was Janet, one of the nurses who had initially been hesitant about Dr. Ellis's inquiries. She pulled Margaret aside, her expression earnest. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to help," she whispered, glancing nervously around. "I've seen things here that aren't right, and I've been too afraid to speak up until now." Her cooperation was a pivotal moment, offering an inside perspective that could validate and deepen their investigation. With Janet's help, Dr. Ellis was able to access more detailed records and employee testimonies, which painted a vivid picture of the systemic issues plaguing not just Willowbrook, but potentially hundreds of facilities across the country. This information became the cornerstone of his presentation at the town hall meeting, drawing gasps and murmurs of disbelief from the audience. Margaret took the podium after Dr. Ellis, her presence commanding attention. "This is not just about Willowbrook," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "This is about a national crisis in elder care. We are here to advocate for reform, for oversight, and for the dignity of every resident in every facility." The audience's response was a mix of applause and outrage. Questions flew fast and thick, ranging from inquiries about specific policies to demands for accountability. Margaret Barr, Susan and Dr. Ellis answered as best they could, promising to take their concerns to higher authorities. As the meeting progressed, local media, which Susan had invited, began broadcasting snippets of the discussion online, quickly catching the attention of regional and then national news outlets. The story of Willowbrook and its brave residents fighting for justice began to spread, igniting public interest and debate. In the days following the town hall, Margaret's phone was incessant with calls from reporters, other facilities residents, and even lawmakers interested in understanding more about the issues raised. Each call fueled her resolve, but also outlined the daunting path ahead. The spotlight on Willowbrook grew, casting shadows on the broader industry practices. Through this exposure, Margaret and her team found new allies, families of residents in other facilities who had observed similar issues and were eager to join the cause. This network, facilitated by Susan's diligent outreach and coordination, began to take the shape of a national advocacy group, with Margaret as one of its key voices. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, the pressure on elder care facilities across the country began to mount. Susan's coordination with advocacy groups and media had not only brought attention to the issue, but also rallied support for legislative change. Yet, with increased visibility came increased resistance from powerful stakeholders in the elder care industry. Margaret noticed a shift in the atmosphere at Willowbrook. Some staff members who had been supportive of her efforts now seemed distant, wary of the ongoing scrutiny. However, Margaret's resolve only strengthened as she encountered more stories from residents and their families, each tale echoing the systemic neglect and mismanagement she had fought against at Willowbrook. As she prepared for an upcoming interview with a major national news network, Margaret and Susan reviewed documents and testimonies they had gathered. We need to present a clear case for why these issues aren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of a much larger problem, Susan advised, her eyes scanning through a damning audit report of several facilities. The emotional toll of the campaign began to weigh heavily on Margaret. One evening, after a particularly harrowing call with a family whose relative had suffered due to negligent care, Margaret felt the burden of her role. She sat quietly in the common room long after everyone else had retired for the night, reflecting on the personal stories that had been shared with her. Her thoughts were interrupted by Paul, who had noticed her solitary figure from the hallway. Joining her, he offered a comforting presence. "It's not easy carrying the hopes and fears of so many," he said gently. Margaret nodded, feeling the solidarity in his understanding. Their conversation drifted to the challenges ahead, particularly the upcoming legislative hearings that would test the strength of their advocacy. Paul suggested a strategy session with Dr. Ellis and Janet to prepare for the hearings. "We need to be as prepared as possible, bringing not just our stories, but also solid data and expert testimonials," he emphasized. Margaret agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose from Paul's tactical approach. The next morning, they gathered in Margaret's apartment, poring over data and planning their testimonies. Dr. Ellis brought in new medical evidence, and Janet shared insights into the operational failures from her insider perspective. Together, they crafted a compelling narrative they hoped would sway lawmakers and secure much-needed reforms. As the legislative hearing date approached, the atmosphere within Willowbrook and the broader community became increasingly charged. News of the impending testimonies traveled fast, prompting a mixed response. Some industry representatives reached out, offering to discuss compromises, which Margaret and her team cautiously agreed to hear. These meetings revealed the industry's anxiety about the proposed changes, with several executives expressing concern over the financial implications and logistical challenges of reform. Meanwhile, Paul's research uncovered a network of ownership and financial ties that suggested a deeper entrenchment of the problematic practices they were fighting against. "It's not just negligence, it's a systematic exploitation," Paul concluded, presenting his findings during one of their strategy meetings. This revelation added a new layer to their presentation, emphasizing the need for robust oversight and transparency. Margaret took these developments as a sign that their efforts were hitting the mark, but also as a warning that the opposition would be formidable and well-resourced. She spent long hours preparing her testimony, determined to make every word count. The night before the hearing, Margaret found herself grappling with doubt. The responsibility of representing so many voices weighed heavily on her, and the fear of not being persuasive enough loomed large. She confided in Susan, who had been her constant support throughout the campaign. "What if it's not enough? What if all our efforts don't lead to change?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with fatigue. Susan reassured her, "You've already changed so much just by bringing this to light. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've started something that can't be undone. Remember, you're not alone in this." The morning of the hearing, Margaret stood outside the legislative building, taking a deep breath of the crisp air, trying to settle her nerves. Inside, the hearing room was filled with lawmakers, media, industry representatives, and advocates. As she took her seat, Margaret felt the gravity of the moment. This was her chance to make a real difference. When called upon, Margaret spoke with clarity and conviction, her voice steady despite the inner turmoil she had felt the night before. She laid out the evidence, shared personal stories from the residents she had spoken with, and called for specific legislative actions. Paul and Dr. Ellis provided expert testimony on the patterns of abuse and the medical repercussions of neglect, while Janet offered a poignant view from inside the industry. The committee listened intently, asking pointed questions that suggested they were taking the issue seriously. However, the industry representatives pushed back hard, arguing about the costs and feasibility of the proposed reforms, trying to sow doubt about the extent of the issues presented. As the hearing concluded, Margaret felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. They had done everything they could to present a compelling case for change. Now it was up to the lawmakers to decide the path forward. In the days following the legislative hearing, the community at Willowbrook and beyond waited with bated breath for a decision. Media coverage had intensified, with debates and discussions about the proposed reforms dominating news cycles. Margaret found herself at the center of this storm, her actions at the hearing lauded by some and criticized by others. Unexpectedly, a prominent senator took up their cause, citing Margaret's testimony as a key influence in his decision to support the reforms. He introduced a bill aimed at overhauling regulatory practices in elder care facilities, drawing national attention. This development sparked a wave of support from other lawmakers, who began to see the reform as not just necessary, but politically viable. Margaret and her team were invited back to the Capitol to discuss the bill's specifics with a group of lawmakers. The discussions were intense and detailed, with Margaret providing insights into the daily realities faced by residents, which many of the legislators had not fully appreciated before. Her first-hand experiences, coupled with the data provided by Dr. Ellis and Paul, proved invaluable in shaping the legislation. As the bill moved through legislative committees, Margaret continued her advocacy, speaking at events and participating in panels to keep the momentum going. However, she also encountered increasing pushback from powerful industry lobbyists who were mobilizing to water down the bill's provisions. One evening, Margaret received an anonymous threat, warning her to back down or face serious consequences. Shaken but undeterred, she shared the incident with her team, reinforcing their resolve to see the reform through. "They wouldn't threaten us if we weren't making an impact," Paul remarked grimly. The climax came on the day of the bill's final vote. Margaret and Susan, Paul, Dr. Ellis and Janet watched from the gallery as lawmakers debated the bill below. The tension was palpable, each statement from the floor echoing the arguments they had heard for months. When the vote finally came, it passed by a narrow margin, amid cheers from some and stark silence from others. The passage of the bill marked a significant victory for Margaret and her team. It mandated stricter oversight, better staffing ratios, and more transparent financial practices for elder care facilities across the nation. The impact of their work was immediate and profound, setting a new standard for the treatment of the elderly. As Margaret left the legislative building, She felt a mix of relief and weariness, tempered by the knowledge that real change was often slow and fraught with challenges. But for now, they had won a crucial battle, one that would improve the lives of countless seniors. The future seemed a little brighter, a little more just, as she walked into the fading sunlight, ready to face whatever challenges might come next. After the legislative victory, Margaret returned to Willowbrook not just as a resident, but as a beacon of change. The news of the bill's passage spread rapidly through the community, sparking celebrations and discussions among the residents and staff. Feeling the tide of change, Margaret organized a community gathering in the common room to discuss the implications of the new law and what it meant for them. "This is just the beginning," Margaret addressed the crowd, her voice brimming with determination. "We've shown that change is possible, but the real work starts now. We need to ensure that the reforms are implemented effectively and that our voices continue to be heard." The meeting turned into a brainstorming session, with residents sharing their ideas and experiences. Suggestions ranged from forming a residents' oversight committee to liaising with local authorities to monitor the changes. Margaret listened intently, her notebook filling with ideas and contact names. This collaborative spirit was exactly what she had hoped to foster. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and her team focused on the implementation phase of the reforms. They met with legal experts and consultants to understand the intricacies of the new regulations and to devise strategies for monitoring compliance. Dr. Ellis took on the responsibility of training the staff at Willowbrook and other nearby facilities about the new standards of care. Susan set up a website and a newsletter to keep the community informed and engaged. The platform quickly became a hub for sharing updates, advice, and stories from residents across the state, helping to maintain momentum and build a network of informed advocates. Meanwhile, Paul used his investigative skills to keep a watchful eye on the industry's response to the reforms. He discovered that some facilities were attempting to circumvent the new rules by subtly redefining service categories or by lobbying for exceptions. Highlighting these tactics, he prepared detailed reports which Margaret used to lobby state regulators for stricter enforcement. As the new standards began to take effect, Margaret and her team organized workshops and seminars for residents and their families, educating them on their rights under the new law and how to advocate for themselves. These initiatives empowered many who had previously felt helpless against the system. As the reforms began to take root, Margaret saw tangible improvements in the care and transparency at Willowbrook and other facilities. However, the success was not uniform, and some troubling reports began to emerge about facilities where conditions had not improved. Margaret decided it was crucial to address these inconsistencies head-on. Together with Dr. Ellis and Susan, Margaret organized a series of unannounced visits to various facilities under the guise of routine inspections, supported by state regulators. These visits revealed a patchwork of compliance. While some facilities had embraced the changes, others had only made superficial adjustments. Confronting the reality of ongoing challenges, Margaret documented everything meticulously, preparing a comprehensive report to present at an upcoming State Oversight Committee meeting. Her goal was to illustrate the need for continuous vigilance and possibly even more stringent measures to ensure compliance across the board. Armed with evidence from their inspections, Margaret addressed the State Oversight Committee with her characteristic poise and determination. She presented her findings, highlighting the discrepancies and calling for an increase in the frequency and thoroughness of inspections. Her testimony was powerful and persuasive, resonating with committee members who had been unaware of the ongoing issues. The committee agreed to adopt stricter monitoring protocols and increased penalties for non-compliance, aligning more closely with Margaret's vision of thorough and enforceable standards. Following the committee meeting, Margaret's role as an advocate for elder care reform gained even greater recognition. Invitations to speak at conferences and participate in policy discussions flowed in, and she became a respected voice in national elder care advocacy circles. The media coverage of her continued fight for justice brought new opportunities to influence public opinion and policy at higher levels. Margaret leveraged this platform to push for nationwide adoption of similar reforms, advocating for federal legislation to protect the rights and dignity of elderly residents across the country. While the new regulations were being implemented, Margaret received a distressing call from an elderly woman named Alice. Alice's son, David, had been accused of mistreating her in a newly compliant facility. The accusations seemed to come out of nowhere, and Alice insisted that David was innocent. Margaret agreed to look into the matter, driven by her commitment to ensuring that reforms didn't lead to unintended consequences. She started by meeting with Alice and David, gaining their trust and understanding their side of the story. David appeared genuinely distressed, while Alice's demeanor suggested a level of vulnerability that needed careful consideration. Margaret's investigation revealed that Alice had been involved in a dispute with the facility's administration over her care. This conflict had escalated, leading to the false accusations. It became clear that some facilities might use allegations as a shield against genuine criticism or to cover up their shortcomings. Margaret continued her investigation into the false accusations against David, uncovering a troubling pattern. It appeared that some facilities were exploiting the new regulations to deflect criticism, leveraging their position to manipulate situations in their favor. She gathered evidence from interviews with staff, residents, and family members, revealing that the facility's administration had a history of unethical practices. The abuse of the new regulations to silence dissent was becoming evident. Margaret prepared a detailed report, including testimonies and evidence that would expose the facility's manipulative tactics. As she presented her findings to the Oversight Committee, the focus of her advocacy shifted from merely enforcing reforms to ensuring that these reforms did not inadvertently create new avenues for abuse. The committee responded with a promise to address these issues, vowing to implement additional safeguards to prevent the exploitation of the reform process. The committee's promise to address the new issues was met with skepticism. Margaret knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. She needed action. To press her case, she arranged a meeting with key stakeholders, including policymakers and facility administrators. During the meeting, Margaret presented her findings and argued passionately for immediate reforms to address the exploitation of the regulations. She highlighted the need for transparent reporting mechanisms and independent oversight to prevent facilities from using regulations as a shield. The stakeholders were divided. Some were resistant to change, fearing it might complicate the implementation of the existing reforms. Others were receptive, acknowledging the need for additional safeguards. The debate was heated, but Margaret's thorough documentation and heartfelt pleas swayed the majority. The committee agreed to initiate a comprehensive review of the regulations, promising to address the loopholes and strengthen oversight. Margaret left the meeting with a mix of relief and apprehension, knowing that the real work was just beginning. With the promise of a review in place, Margaret turned her attention to the immediate challenge of ensuring that the reform process was not derailed. She faced resistance from some facility administrators who were determined to protect their interests and minimize scrutiny. Margaret organized a series of workshops and seminars to educate facility staff and administrators about the importance of ethical practices and the proper implementation of the reforms. Her goal was to foster a culture of transparency and accountability. During one of these workshops, she encountered fierce opposition from a prominent administrator named Victor. Victor publicly criticized Margaret's approach, accusing her of being overly punitive and undermining the reform process. The confrontation was intense, and Margaret's position was scrutinized by many. In a dramatic showdown, Margaret confronted Victor, presenting evidence of his facility's unethical practices. The encounter was both a public and personal test for Margaret. She had to balance her commitment to reform with the need to address the personal attacks and resistance she faced. As the confrontation with Victor intensified, Margaret realized that her position was increasingly precarious. To expose the full extent of the corruption and malpractices, she needed to gather irrefutable evidence. She enlisted the help of a trusted journalist, Adrian Day, to dig deeper into the hidden aspects of the facilities. Adrian's investigation uncovered shocking revelations: falsified records, manipulated reports, and illicit deals between some administrators and corporate entities. These findings were not only a testament to the extent of the corruption, but also a potential threat to Margaret's safety. Feeling the pressure, Margaret faced a crucial decision. She could go public with the information and risk retaliation, or try to negotiate for further protections and reforms behind the scenes. She chose to reveal the truth, understanding that the risk was necessary to achieve lasting change. The publication of the exposé caused a media frenzy. Margaret faced backlash from those whose interests were threatened, but she also received widespread support from the public and reform advocates. Despite the personal threats and mounting pressures, Margaret remained resolute, knowing that her sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. The fallout from the exposé was intense. Several administrators faced legal action, and new regulations were rapidly put in place to prevent future abuses. Margaret was hailed as a hero by some, but also vilified by others who saw her actions as a threat to their power. As the dust settled, Margaret reflected on the journey. She had faced significant personal and professional challenges, but her efforts had led to real change. The revised regulations included stronger oversight, better transparency, and enhanced protection for those who reported misconduct. Margaret's victory was bittersweet. The reforms were a significant achievement, but they came at a personal cost. She had sacrificed her privacy, faced threats, and endured public scrutiny. Yet, her dedication to the cause had made a lasting impact. Margaret walked through the facility she had fought so hard to reform. It was a symbol of the progress made and the future still to be shaped. She knew the battle was ongoing, but she had laid a strong foundation for continued advocacy and reform. As she looked towards the horizon, Margaret was hopeful. The world had changed because of her efforts, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she was ready to face it with the same courage and commitment that had guided her through this tumultuous journey. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.